Adam Taxin with Rabbi Akiva Hall in Biloxi, Mississippi, one of the newest Chabads, the only one in the state of Mississippi, and we're talking about Genesis, specifically Parsha Beshalach, even more specifically chapter 34, the rape or abduction of Dinah. Rabbi, thanks for joining me. Why don't you tell us what this episode in the Torah is about?
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. In this chapter of Genesis, it's describing an unusual situation when the patriarch Jacob and his family are settling in the land of Israel. A local non-Jewish prince belonging to a city-state called Shechem, his name is also Shechem, the prince, he happened to see one of Jacob's daughters, Dinah, and he became smitten with her, and he took it upon himself to try to marry her. Of course, Jacob and his family, the first Jewish main family, is very apprehensive of her marrying into a non-Jewish royalty of a city-state. But despite this, Shechem abducted her and brought her with him to his city. Jacob's sons, Shimon.
And they did that.
We're not entirely sure, but
okay.
It could be implied by some interpretation.
Was it with her consent or not? Again, we're not entirely sure.
I don't believe so.
But okay.
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Shimon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, were very, very upset by this occurrence. So they came to Shechem, this non-Jewish prince, and gave him an ultimatum. They said, if you circumcise yourself and all the males of your city, you can marry Dinah. If you have a conversion, you can marry her. So Shechem was very happy with this, to have the approval from Jacob's family. So he had the entire city circumcised. In the midst of their recovery from circumcision, Shimon and Levi, Jacob's two sons, went into the city, took back their sister Dinah, and wiped out all of the men who were in the midst of their recovery. When they came back to their father Jacob, Jacob wasn't very happy about this. He said, how could you go and murder this entire city?
Yeah.
For various reasons, Jacob wasn't happy with this outcome. The brothers retorted, is it proper that our sister Dinah, your daughter, should be treated with a common prostitute? Jacob didn't respond to this. However, God is not mentioned in this entire episode. We see in general this is not although there might be some justification for Shimon and Levi's action, it was not a divinely ordained event. It's not a very happy episode in the Jewish nation. If you parallel this with a similar story in the book of Samuel, the first Jewish king, Saul, is commanded by God to wipe out the evil nation of Amalek, the Amalekites. Man, woman, and child, even animals. For his own personal reasons, he had a bias, and he didn't want to kill certain members of this people.
Because being the youngest member of the Hall family in the background there.
Oh,
but she's not upset about the story. She's too young to appreciate that, but she may make an appearance every sorry, go on.
No problem. So in the story, the Bible tells us in the book of Samuel, Saul doesn't kill the entire nation. God is very upset by this.
This is not for children, Leah. You probably don't want to hear about this. It'll give you nightmares.
He sends his prophet Samuel and lets Saul know, because you did not follow God's will by killing the entire nation of Amalek, the Amalekites, your seed, your progeny, will not continue in the monarchy. Rather, it'll be for David, like people are familiar with. So we have two very similar stories here. In our Torah portion this week, some members of the Jewish nation commit a war, you could even say a genocide, without God's approval, and it was a negative event. Maybe there's justification, it's a negative story. However, in the book of Samuel, it's the opposite. Saul decided not to
She really wants to hear about this. Why don't you put it on your lap? This is not one of the parts of the Torah for children. They're not going to have a book for toddlers about this. But you want to hear it? Hey, just don't be mad at me for exposing her to this. Okay. This would be Leah.
Yeah.
Leah Hall, making your first appearance. Or maybe your second appearance on TV. All right, go on. Sorry.
So because Saul did not fight this war from God, he was punished. So we see in Judaism, there's a time for war, a time for peace. There's right and wrong. We don't accept every opinion. We don't accept every lifestyle. But only when it comes from God, when there's a reason to go to war, to fight a battle, then it's appropriate. But if we're fighting, even in our own personal lives, if we become impassioned from our own selfish reasons, and we fight a war or do destructive actions, very possibly there could be negative outcome. Only when it's channeled properly through a divine, not a person says they hear God's voice, but through the appropriate tradition and through an appropriate way of acting, that's when good things come about. When a person acts by their own passion and their own ego to do violent things or destructive things, that could lead to very negative consequences.
So that's the lesson. This is not one that lends itself to an immediate lesson. Obviously, most people watching that aren't going to commit genocide.
That's correct. We apply it in our own private lives, in our own way, how it applies to us. The Torah is eternal and applies in every situation, even in times when the literal understanding is not possible, like in this case. All right.
Thanks for sharing that.
My
with all of
pleasure.
us.
Thank you very much.
Stop recording here. My mouse.
In the middle.
Okay, there it is.